Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And Fateme, brilliant to have you here. And to start with, please introduce yourself and tell everybody about the great work that you do.
Thank you, Alan, for inviting me. My name is Fateme Banishoeib. I'm a little bit of a mix of interest, a mix of passion, a mix of industry and works that I bring together, namely science, entrepreneurship, and art, or painting and poetry. And I like to think of myself as a bridge between worlds that apparently don't come together close. So I see myself literally as a bridge. I grew up in a mixed family and with a Persian father and an Italian mother. So I guess since my childhood, I had to bridge to different cultures. And this is what I currently do. This is the vocation I've chosen. This is the work I do. I try to bridge in my work different perspective, different mindset, and different world, and look at the world of business with the eyes of an artist. What happens when we do that? And that's the inquiry I often bring to the table. And from there, we explore new worlds when possible.
Well, thank you for that. And it strikes me that this is likely to be found in people more and more these days than maybe it was 20 years ago. Is that your experience or not?
In a certain way, yes. So I have to say that the separation between what is science and art is only something that we have known with the Industrial Revolution. Before it wasn't the case. So people would get exposed to both as equal domains, so science and art. So it wouldn't be that weird that a doctor would paint or that a physics would write poems. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we have split the two worlds, making one, namely the arts, more of as something like frivolous and hobby. I myself have a PhD in chemistry, and for decades, while I was studying, I was making a name and a reputation in the field of pharmaceutical chemistry. I completely forgot that side of me, and it took a lifetime, as I say, to bring it back. And you're right. So for decades, much more than decades, the two were separated. And I would say that in the past few years, there is a kind of sensitivity to it, an openness to it. That doesn't mean that we are reclaiming, or as I like to say, we are evoking the artist within each and every one of us. Yet we are not there yet, but I have hopes for the future.
Hmm. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about was capability, technical capability.
Mhm.
And the reason that I'm curious about this is that I can't write poetry, I can't draw,
Mhm.
paint, but I love both areas.
Mhm.
And yet, when I've spoken to people who are like me, they have kind of said, "Well, I can't be interested in it because I can't do it."
That's very common, sadly. It's very common, and if you allow me, I'll just bring a little anecdote. Very often, when I facilitate workshop, especially in corporate context, and then I ask uh, vast majority leaders or executive in organization to write a poem, for example, they would say, "Oh, but I'm not a poet." That's the first thing that someone would say, and my answer is always, "Me neither. I have a PhD in chemistry." And that somehow gives people permission
Yeah.
to mm, experiment and to explore. To me, is to be an artist, to be a poet, to be a painter. It's a way of being, not necessarily the product that we make. It's a lens through which we live life. It's a practice that allows us to open our hearts, embody empathy, express our feelings, something that we are not usually taught or invited to. So as someone more famous than I, Berenson said, I'm interested in the behavior of art, not in the outcome of art. And that's exactly what I invite people into. So a little invitation here. So the moment we hear that, oh, but I'm not a poet, that's exactly the moment we should start. Maybe writing a little poem to the non-poet as what he or she will say, what they will say, what do they have to say, and we can slowly, if we wish to, create a practice that allows us to express something that our clever minds don't allow ever us to do.
Yeah. Okay, I could talk about this, but we're here to talk about ValuesJam. So let's choose a card.
Okay.
Tip out the cards from the deck. And please let me know how many piles of cards I should make in front of me.
8.
8 piles. That's the most I've ever had anybody say. I'm gonna have to move my mouse to give me extra room.
I know,
Okay,
I'm
and
always a little bit challenging. Always be scared of the poet in the room.
2, 4, 6, 7. So, right, and now, so I have 2 rows. The top row has 3 piles, and the bottom row has 5 piles.
Mhm.
So, would you like the top or the bottom row?
The top.
Okay, so now we have 3. So on my left is pile 1, on my
Mhm.
right is pile 3. So which pile would you like?
Pile 1.
Pile 1. And in this pile, we have 9 cards. So a number between 1 and 9, please.
9.
9. Well, what do you think of this card?
Oh, I love it. Courage. Mm.
Courage. So
I
the
love it.
first question is, well, let me ask you, why do you love it?
It's something I always, think about and reflect on, am I showing courage or am I more driven by fear? And what showing courage would look like? Which choices would I make? What would I do? How would I feel? And here I will quote Maya Angelou, uh, the wise Maya Angelou, who said once that courage is the first virtue. Without it, we cannot practice the other virtues. So, and I believe that, and I really believe that. So, to practice any of the other virtues, we have to show courage. And so I always think about it, and I kind of love it because it comes from the art anyway. So it's an expression of the capacity of our hearts to create, to make, to dismantle, to rebel, to imagine, to invent all sorts of things.
And I love the association with the French word cœur for heart.
Exactly,
Cœur,
exactly.
Um, all right, so the first question is a very simple one, but maybe people listening to this might not have thought to ask this question, and that is, what does courage mean? And as a follow-up, tapping into your creative side, what does courage look, feel, and sound like?
Um, can I read you a poem?
I'd love you to.
I actually wrote many years ago. I'll have to see if in my pile I can find it. So bear with me. I've written many years ago a poem titled Courage. And that is somehow my definition of courage. There it is. So the poem is called Courage. Courage to have the heart to admit I've been afraid to be real. I have been hiding from the challenges, walking away from feelings and their consequences. I proclaim my courage, shouting victim, denying the necessity of relationships. Confused, I realize what I really care about is love, connection, and hugs I had exiled. In the act of declaring game over, raising the white flag, looking back, I saw a siege. I saw a throne, the throne of courage. I stepped into. I needed affection, attention, interaction. That fight could not be played from distance. It required contact. In the contact with the warrior, the war field of my heart became the playground for new discoveries.
Wow.
In a way, this is what courage represents to me. Often I think in our narratives, in our way of talking about life, talking about conflict, talking about tension, talking about challenges, we engage into bravery in a battlefield and to an action of strength. Courage is very different. It's very, very different. It could be a playground, that the war field of my heart became the playground for new discoveries. So it's really that openness to look inside and discover something that goes beyond strength, which is indeed courage. Looking into fear and not pretending or engaging in the narrative that we have to become fearless, that we have to lose fear, or we have to defeat, even worse, fear. But really look at in the eyes of fear and asking the question we are afraid to ask. And see what we discover, see where we can get in contact with what scares us, not to defeat it, not to overcome it, but to learn, to discover it, to learn about it or whatever. And I think that's a true act of courage.
And you've given me two. First of all, what a beautiful poem. Is that in one of your books?
Yes, it is. It's in a collection called The Poetry of Leadership. And there it is,
Okay.
with
And
my little notes.
where can people find that?
It can be found on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, on all the, the retailers that people normally use to get their books. It can be ordered through bookstores and is quite, yeah, quite easy to get. And it came out of a desire of, actually not really a desire, a request, which then transformed into a desire. At the beginning, when I started bringing poetry into corporations and facilitating workshop, enabling people to express their feelings, their emotions, and even look at conflicts, because we spoke about conflicts in this poem I just read. The question that everyone asked me, like, and now how do we do when you are gone?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, corporation after corporation, that was the pattern. Everyone would ask me, now how do we do when you're gone? So I thought about selecting a number of poems people could relate to, people in corporation or people anywhere in the world, that to me spoke about leadership. And leadership to me is not linked to a role. It's how we lead our presence, how we embrace our presence, how we show up in life, in the world, regardless of the role that we have into an organization. So I made a selection of poems that I had already written and joined them with reflection prompts to help people to discover, explore, experiment with some of the themes that, to me, are linked or support leadership. And a very specific kind of leadership, a leadership that is more caring, that is more compassionate, that is more courageous, what I call humanship, because sometimes I think that we have made a myth of leadership. And so it's a role out there. People are born with it, and there is this, myth and aura around it. And I actually don't believe it. I think it is a capacity we need to cultivate. It is definitely not something that is bestowed on us because of the role of a title we have in an organization. And definitely doesn't need to be so colored with some, I would say even patriarchal ways of seeing the world. I mean, the theory of the great man, the undefeatable leader, the visionary that drags the troops, and all this, war or competitive metaphors. I think it could be something completely different if we allow ourselves to rewrite it. And what better way than poetry to rewrite it?
Yeah. There's a number of things listening to you that come to mind. Two pieces of work by other people, actually. So, are you familiar with Susan David's work?
Yes, of
Okay,
course.
so she talks about courage not being the absence of fear, but
Mhm.
walking hand in hand with fear, which is
Mhm.
what you described in some way. And then you talked about how in corporate organizations they said to you, how are we going to carry on when you leave? And this reminds me of Simon Sinek's work around the difference between intensity and consistency. Are you familiar with
Mm.
that?
No, no, please,
There's
please.
so what he uses oral hygiene as an example or a metaphor, and he says,
Mhm.
you know, we feel really good when we've booked our annual checkup for our
Mhm.
teeth, and it hurts a bit because we've signed the check, and then we go and we've got, clean teeth for a little while, and is it that stops your teeth falling out?
Mm.
And of course, the answer is no, it's not at all. It's the cleaning your teeth twice a day for 2 minutes or
Yes.
whatever it is. And then he asks, what happens if I miss one? Do my teeth
Mm.
fall out? No, they don't.
Mhm.
And he draws the parallel between organization, the way organizations work, where, and this is my experience in the corporate world, a lot of attention is given to, for instance, the annual leadership meeting.
Yep.
You get an inspirational speaker in to talk to
Yeah.
everybody gets really excited and motivated. And then the next day they go back to work and everything is the way it was before.
Mm.
And I'm a great fan of business as usual being much more important than new projects,
Mhm.
because ultimately that's what gives you the consistency piece. And so for your poetry, and actually, I relate this to my work as well, because when I do the equivalent of what you would do with a poetry event, I kind of say this isn't important, really. It's what's important is what you do next and what you
Mhm.
carry on to do, because if nothing changes, what was the point?
Exactly. And it's also understanding that, a culture, and we are talking here about a corporation, so a culture within a company is not done by, an inspiring event, or is not changed by an inspiring event, is not changed by a poster with, inspiring statements on it. It is truly the manifestation and the embodiment of the mindset and the behaviors of everyone. And of course, as we spoke about leadership and leaders just now, people watch. I remember when I was a young leader into an organization, a mentor of mine told me, like, look, everyone is watching you. If you come, and we were going through a very difficult moment in the organization, we were going through a restructuring, so a lot of people most probably had to lose their jobs. So it was a very difficult moment in the company history. And this mentor of mine told me, like, look, everyone is watching you. So if they see you preoccupied, nervous, or something, they won't think it's something personal. They will think, oh, I'm going to lose my job today. And so what do you do? Because everyone is watching. That in that specific moment, I understood that I could influence the weather into an organization. And that was my responsibility. How did I want to influence the weather? If I was feeling whatever, miserable for whatever reason, it wasn't, okay for me to make everyone feel the same. So since that moment, I always walked into any organization from that point up until now, even when I walk as a consultant now into an organization, say, okay, how do you want to influence the weather here? And so we need to know that culture is somehow the weather within any organization. So how do we want the weather to be? And we are all responsible somehow to influence that weather. Of course, when someone has a leadership position, people look at them and get impacted. People say that you bring your boss at home, which is true, or how the boss made you feel, and you bring it at home. Yes, but we also need to know that we can influence that weather back. If we show up courageously, we may actually able to influence, and we might never know. We might never know. We can't, do it because the reward is coming. No, we have to do it because we care about the weather. And so we have to show courage. And I care about the weather. How do I want the weather to be? And embody that weather. And in a way, the culture gets shape and gets transformed by each and every one, mindset, behavior.
It's so true. And I I can't remember if this was a conversation or if it was a response to a LinkedIn. Oh, I think it was a response to a LinkedIn post. And I believe that many leaders seem to either not understand that they can influence the weather,
Mm-hmm.
or they, for some reason, choose not to take advantage of the fact that they can influence the weather. When you hear leaders, sometimes they talk about, oh, it's the culture in the organization, as though this culture is an entity on its own and operates in a vacuum and you can't influence it. And there was an example that the guy used. He said, if there is somebody in a senior position who is, I think, bullying other people in the organization, then there will be a culture of fear. That was the
Mm-hmm.
point they were making. And so in my response, I said, the senior leaders in the organization have a choice,
Mm-hmm.
because either they can address that issue and deal with it, and then the culture of fear is likely to reduce, or they can do nothing, which effectively means they condone what the guy is doing, and then that will enforce the culture of
Fear.
fear. But either
Yeah.
way, it doesn't happen on its own.
No. Or this, you are right in what you're just saying, but it makes me think that there is a third option, that often they say, oh, we need to change the culture, let's call a consultant or a pool of consultants to change the culture, as if it can be changed from outside. And so that's why I wrote this book that goes together, poems and prompts for reflection, because culture is transformed from inside out, not from outside. Okay, of course, some external influences may shake it, but we can, if mindset and behaviors of the people who live there, work there, every single day is not transformed, culture will not be transformed. And that's why here I will say it again. It might look like, I'm obsessed, and I am a little bit, but here is the key, here is the point, or at least it is to me, is the practice that changes. It's not the single event. It's not the tool that changes something. Is the practice that enables us to change and to transform something. And to me, the first practice is self-awareness. If we do not become aware of our own whether to use a metaphor we just use of our own climate, how inside of us, how can we pretend to be aware or even change or lead whatever the climate outside us? And that's, to me, is the paradox of leadership. Everyone wants to be a leader, except that when it comes to following our own heart, following our own instinct, following our own intuition, following the right thing to do, following, what courage tells us to do, then no. And so to me, it's like, okay, there is no leadership without following. And that doesn't mean, because we always imagine, if now we were among people live, we would close your eyes, imagine a leader, and everyone would imagine whatever, someone at the top and then someone else following. But we never imagine that actually the other side of the coin of leadership is followership or following, which means we first have to follow what's inside us, what's within us. And that's true for everyone.
Yeah, there's I don't know whether you've seen it. It's a video called Dancing Guy.
It rings a bell. It rings a bell.
So the video is of this guy at an outdoor festival.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know the one?
Yeah.
And the point being made is that without first followers, all there is a lone nut.
And to me is also like, the first follower is ourselves. And the first follower is this capacity of, exploring what lives inside us, what wants to be expressed. And that could be the fears, the visions, the motivation, the desires, the dreams. It can be anything. But if we can't, really explore and follow the kind of inner dialogue, how are we going to have a dialogue with someone else outside us? How? This flow cannot happen. Then it will be like an audience again, which is also what I think art and poetry help us, unblock. It enables a certain flow, a certain dialogue. Otherwise, it's just a monologue to an audience or a preaching to a choir. And that's not, and I'm not saying that that has no value. Maybe there is value for, talking to an audience and motivating an audience. I'm not saying that there is no value, but I'm more interested in what happens when there is this exchange, when there is a true dialogue happening. So what happens between two people having a true dialogue? What happens when there is dialogue within an organization? And of course, again, we need to show courage in the moments in which those dialogues become messy, in which we might not be aligned. And I mean, alignment isn't the only outcome. Are we mature enough to make space also for those tensions and allow someone else to express what they have inside, even when we don't agree? And I think art is a very inclusive space for that. If you think we can express whatever is going on, even a conflict or a tension in a painting, in a poem, in a dance, any form of art, and someone may see something else, and it's still a creative act, rather than a destructive act. Is creative also because it's not silencing emotions. It's not, suppressing for the sake of, showing no emotion or, remain composed. In art, we can find a creative way to express that and receive that also, because it's not just the expressing, also receiving someone anger, grief, frustration, receive it in a very different way.
And listening to you, I don't want to give traditional leadership a hard time, but it does.
I wanted to give it a very hard time. I really wanted. I really wanted.
Well, yeah, so I think it's all about context, isn't it? And
Yeah.
we can always talk about situations where things are not appropriate, but sometimes traditional leadership where somebody makes a decision and then tells everybody else what to do is very valuable. But
Sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying that there is no space for that. The context matters. Context always matters. What I'm trying to say is that mm, to develop an inclusive capacity to or to make space to the rainbow of emotions can be so diverse. We need um, courage. To go back to the card, we need the courage, to say, okay, that's what is needed now. And that's what it's so face it. And then we need a safe space where this can be expressed without, fear, without judgment. So we also need to develop at the same time a literacy to express those emotions, which often is not the case. So what we label as inappropriate very often is an incapacity or a lack of, way or a less skillful way to express something, and then we bump into each other, and that tension becomes destructive rather than constructive. And I think that if we look at the arts as a practice, first of all, to learn to express our own emotions, even the one that makes us uncomfortable. Then we make space for others to do the same, and we can find ways to enable others to do that. I mean, I've very often been called into organization to do conflict resolution. So that when they have tried everything, they have called all sorts of coaches, therapists, and still there is a lot of dysfunction. And very often, that's the first thing I ask them to do. I ask everyone to write a poem about the conflict, and everyone writes their own poem. And then so that the first poem, they put everything down. Like very raw, and you can see the pain. There is typically when there is conflict, there isn't anyone who is happy and say, oh, I'm so glad there is everyone is suffering different amounts, but everyone is somehow in pain, is in discomfort. There are degrees. And so that's the first poem I ask them to write. And then very often I ask them to write a second poem in which the conflict is resolved. What is so if the conflict was resolved, how that would look like? What would be the emotion? So I can somehow help people, even though it's difficult because they are living there in the midst of the conflict in that moment. So what happens if or how the conflict would dissolve and fall away? And then they write a second poem. So my remark is always, always, no one in the second poem, so in the conflict resolution poem, no one kills anyone, no one gets rid of anyone. And suddenly they realize that there are possibilities ahead of them. And then another thing, when I ask people to read out loud these poems, and it requires, a bit of facilitation because some emotions can be, quite charged and quite raw. There is a capacity to connect to someone else's pain and see, oh, they are not just making trouble. They are not just, there is pain there. Suddenly, the word, the word that nobody wants to say, I'm in pain, is felt rather than said.
but
It's felt. And that changes the dynamics. That really changes the dynamics.
this goes. So when I was saying about not wanting to criticize traditional leadership, that was kind of tongue in cheek because when I was listening to you talk about humanizing, or in this situation, I think it's the same because what you're doing is you're getting people to connect on a much more emotional level, not so
Mhm,
much the job roles they do and
mhm.
all of that sort of stuff. So traditional leadership seems to want to drive out all of the human elements, and then it tends to be self-serving because it makes it easier if you can just tell people what to do. And if you focus on them performing to a certain level that you require of them, and it's a false sense of security as well because you feel that you're in control of everything because you've got this plan of what's going to happen. Um, but actually, what you're foregoing is everything that you've described in terms of people's human connection and commitment and collaboration, people working together, the acceptance of imperfection and vulnerability. So in a way, traditional leadership doesn't show very much courage. It kind of hides behind organization. Whereas if you're willing to open it up and risk it being a little bit more messy to deal with, then you can often get much better results.
Well, I have to say, and here I'm not defending leadership, but it's a kind of course, I'm generalizing here, and so it's not completely true for everyone. But I think this is a human tendency. We seek security, and so we have a tendency to control rather than feel. And so we tend to think, make a plan, make an Excel spreadsheet, lay down whatever our strategy and so on. So that I think is a tendency of humanity in general. Because emotions are unpredictable, we cannot control them. They make us feel, in certain cases, out of control, discomfort, and all series of things. However, we know, and as a scientist, I like to underline this. We know because neuroscience tells us that first we feel, then we think, and only afterwards we act. Feel is the thing most of us forget. We tend to suppress. We don't have a language to express feeling, or when we have it, it's very minimal. And then, of course, because it's like a stool that is not balanced, because we suppress or we try to control the feeling or we neglect the feeling aspect, we have to go in overthinking. Or in some cases, in, even in lower thinking, if that exists, because it's like somehow we paralyze and we don't get this information. And then our actions are very poor because they are not informed by the feeling. However, if we allow, so that's why I always lead and always lead with the feeling first, because anyway, is what's going to happen. First we feel, then we think, and only afterwards we act. So my invitation is always like, okay, let's feel everything we need to feel up until the end. After, we can think about it. And only afterwards we can make our brilliant plans.
Yeah, no,
And we always forget the feeling. We always
yeah.
forget. We make plans which
I'm,
are very poor
I'm,
because we
I'm,
forget.
I'm curious to ask you about this thinking stage because um, the other thing that can happen is that we might start with the feeling, but then we might allow the thinking to take over
Of course.
and convince ourselves to do something different than the feeling was saying in the first place.
Of course, or we may rationalize our
Yeah,
feelings, which is
yeah,
another way of bypassing feelings. So that's why I say no, we have to feel until the end. What's underneath? Because feel, you mentioned Susan David before. feelings are, emotions are multi-layered. It's not just one single thing. What's under and what's under and what's under. So that's why I keep insisting on the word practice, because that requires practice, courage to go another layer down and another layer down and another layer down. And sometimes alone we can't. We need the support of someone else or something else, art, for example. And so when that happens, the tendency to bypass decrease. What you just said is it happens very often, but because we want to, I don't want to feel this. Let me pack it, make it very, very neat, so I can control it again. And I've said that I have felt my emotions and blah, blah, and then I can move on. It's almost like we are burdened by it. But I was about to say it's the feeling that makes us more human. And that's actually not true, because it's this, the multi-layers of feeling, thinking, acting, and how they inform. Because it's not that they happen in a line, in a very linear way. They are interwoven, and they happen and they influence, because sometimes they happen at the same time. It's not that we are like a machine. Step one, feel. Yeah. So they happen at the same time. So is the presence, and that to me is leadership. The presence of being aware. Oh, okay, that thought created that feeling, and that feeling has informed that action. And now all this. That's why it's a weather. It's not static. Well, the weather keeps moving and changing. When we watch the weather maps, they are brilliant. I absolutely love them, because they are moving all the time, especially when, there are winds and storms. They move all the time. They are not static. It's not a picture. And so that requires a lot of practice.
And I'm a convert in the word practice. So you might not know, but my first book was called The 31 Practices, and that's a book about organizational values. And the second book was My 31 Practices, which helps people lead their lives aligned with their values. So I'm absolutely with you in terms of practice. I love what you just said about how the feelings and the thoughts and the acts are dynamic rather than like a photograph. And in the summer, we were on holiday on an island in Greece, and it was our intention to go to the top of a mountain because we heard that you could see the whole of the perimeter of the island from the top of this mountain. But we were on the south side of the mountain, and the road that was easiest, apparently, was on the north side. But it was a long way round, so we decided to try and find a way on the south side and failed miserably. So I had been following sat nav in the car and just couldn't go up these roads. And in the end, I remember we're driving along this road, and I just thought, I'm not going to listen to the sat nav anymore. I'm just going to turn off here. And we went up this winding road, and then we came around a bend, and I don't know why, but I looked up, and there was a massive bird perched on the top of a tree. And then another one came, and I managed to get two really bad photographs of them. And when we got home, I put it on social media to say, does anybody know what these birds are? And somebody came back saying, you lucky person, they were two golden eagles. And, our intention had been to go to the top of a mountain. We had no idea or no ambition to go and find two golden eagles. But because I don't know what feelings there were and why. You can't really explain that because your feelings don't know that 30 minutes later, you're going to come across these two things. But what I do know is that increasingly, in my experience, the known is vastly overestimated in terms of value, and the unknown is totally underestimated in terms of what might come.
Totally underestimated. I'm reading right now a book from Rebecca Solnit, Hope in Moments of Dark, something like that. And she speaks about hope as, the beginning of action. and somehow the a capacity to trust in the unknown. That doesn't mean we cannot have hope only if we succeed. Can we trust in the unknown? And I found it brilliant because, in a certain way, hope becomes a practice of courage.
Yeah.
And because, we can exercise courage only if we trust. And we have to trust in life something, bigger than us. Of course, we may trust, our skills, our capacity, whatever, the support and so on. But ultimately, we have to trust the unknown.
Yeah.
Something, and so then hope becomes a very active force because we need to act upon our hopes. It's
Yeah.
not just, okay, let me sit here and hope for the best. Well, and in the book, how she writes is no, is the active role, is being an activist of
Yeah.
hope,
Yeah.
what we do. And I find absolutely brilliant because there is this, act and this action that goes with it. So it's not just, a wishful thinking that things might turn the best. No, what we do to make it, the best that we can with what we have. And also, she writes something very important. I found very important that the opposite of hope is despair.
Mm-hmm.
And despair is actually kind of certitude.
Mm-hmm.
We are certain that things will not change.
Mm-hmm.
And is also, in a way, a show off of impatience
Mm-hmm.
because we are not patient enough to continue act upon our hope and see how things change. And I find it absolutely brilliant because everything is active in the way she writes about it. We are not the passive recipient of hope or despair. It's
Exactly.
our actions that will shift from one state or the other.
I think the other thing is that in order to be better in that place that you've described, we need to address a couple of things. One is I tend not to use the words success and failure because what do
Mm.
they really mean? If you made a choice, it might turn out that they're not as good as you thought they were going to be, but that doesn't mean to say it is a failure. Similarly, often when we have achievements, it's not really us that made that happen. It's external. It's the weather that made that happen. Um, and then the other thing is this need or desire to predict an outcome
Mm-hmm.
when you cannot often do that. So why do we invest so much energy and then hold ourselves to account against an outcome that we couldn't possibly have predicted? Now, I'm conscious of time, and we always bring a values jam to a close with the same question,
Mm.
which is this: what are you encouraged to do differently about courage as a result of our conversation?
To befriend fear. So learn a little bit more about fear. Have a dialogue with fear. Have the courage to have a dialogue with the fear that is blocking you, or is scaring or is terrifying you. Have a dialogue.
Okay.
Metaphorically and literally, have a dialogue with fear. What fear has to tell you, and
And
how can you respond courageously?
if you don't feel able to answer this question, that's absolutely fine. But is there anything that comes to mind to you that you might have a dialogue with yourself about as a first step towards what you've just described?
Tell Tell me that again, please. I just want to be sure I understood
So,
correctly.
so you said to befriend fear
Fear.
and to have a dialogue with it. So, in practical terms, how might you move towards that?
In practical ways, well, there is an exercise that I often do. I literally write in the voice of fear, in the voice of whatever that part of me that is feeling fear. So I ask a question to fear, and then I respond, and then I continue, so on, and without editing myself, without going into overthinking, but allowing myself to feel, and then I let it sit for a while, and then I reread it to myself, and then I learn a few things.
Okay.
Every time I learn a few things.
So I'd like to know, you mentioned that book with the word hope in it, and I'd like to know the name of the book and the author because I want to read it.
So the author is Rebecca Solnit, and I believe the title of the book is Hope in Moments of Dark, something like that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Fateme, that was a Values Jam about courage. I hope you enjoyed it. I
I love
certainly
that.
did. So thank you so much for your time today.